Hey, so I've just been confronted so many times just having a presence on the internet or anywhere on the internet. Joseph Smith is disparaged in a lot of things about his death. I found were pretty inaccurate. And I've done a ton of research the last 5 years. I've read so many original sources and accounts from both sides, from people that think he lived plural marriage to those who didn't. And I'm just going to talk a little bit focused more on his death and some of the inaccurate and accurate things that are out there. We're just not perfect. Historians are not perfect. I'm not perfect. I figure out I'm wrong all the time. So just prefacing, I don't think I'm smarter or better than anyone else, but I'm very confident in what I think actually happened. So, I think an important date is February 1844 is when Joseph Smith announced his presidential bid. And so from churchofjesuschrist.org, History Topics states Joseph had written to 5 men expected to be candidates for the presidency in the election of 1844, asking each man what he would do to protect the citizens' rights of the Latter-day Saints if he were elected. 3 of the men responded, but none of them promised to help the saints. As a result, the quorum of the 12 apostles nominated Joseph Smith to be a candidate. Joseph had been mayor since about May 1842 because John C. Bennett resigned because he was found guilty of committing adultery, and he also was leading the Nauvoo Legion, was kicked out of that, and he started prostitution ring in Nauvoo. And among the Nauvoo Legion, he was leading the Nauvoo Legion. That's important to note. He targeted very young women who had husbands on missions, and widows, specifically as far as husbands on mission. Orson Pratt, his wife Sarah Pratt, was targeted. And I'm starting to really believe that she actually was more of a victim to manipulation and abuse. But anyway, High Council minutes from May 1842 showed that way too many men, unfortunately, followed Bennett, and they started living spiritual life. That's what they called it. And that's what it was, by what I've come to learn that mean. So it was something very, very different from polygamy, which is one man, more than one wife. They're committed. And if celestial plural marriage, it's for time and eternity. If it's eternity only, you're like engaged, maybe you'll be together. And a lot of those are probably not going to happen from that time period, but not going into that. Spiritual wifery is an evil play on words back then. Like since 1820, it was in America. So if you research it, it's technically free love. Women were shared among men. They didn't really have like a husband. She could be like, this is my husband. She was shared. In turn, Bennett accuses Joseph Smith of doing the same. In turn, the church announced their view on marriage, stating from the Church Historians Press, I'm going to quote them now, church members respond October 1st, 1842, probably a few months after he started spouting stuff. Edition of the Times and Seasons, the newspaper, printed a copy of a statement on the Doctrine of Marriage, from 1835 edition of the Doctrine of Covenant, saying we declare that we believe one man should have one wife and one woman, one husband, except in the case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. This was followed by a statement signed by leading Mormon men that refuted Bennett's claims as foul and infamous slander upon an innocent people, because he was claiming all of Nauvoo was prostitution, and he just got sucked into it. Joseph was doing it. Affidavits were signed by the Relief Society. This is me just clarifying, denying any accusations that Joseph Smith, they were his spiritual wives, which again, we explain the difference there. So, and then they state in the Church Historians Press, at least 3 of the undersigned women had firsthand experience with plural marriage. Likely differentiated in their minds between what they saw as inspired system of marriage, commanded by God, and Bennett's practice of unlicensed bigamy or polygamy, which they believed manipulated innocent women to serve men's baser desires. As I read this statement from the Church Historian Press, I'm a little bit pissed off. They do not mention or explain how horrific and different spiritual wifery is. If they did, a lot less people would be leaving the church. It was not akin to polygamy. Bennett was not messing around with a bunch of women and staying committed to them. And he and Higby often were not getting consent, according to the High Council minutes. Most of the time, and according to Emma, it was rapine, quote by her. Women were being shared. Emma did not mince words, unlike how church historians today do. Possibly they just don't want to talk about dark things, is the truth. But they had to be blunt back then. I wish we were today. Being blunt meant they were protecting women from sexual abusers. Church history is whitewashed. a lot of times only alluding to what truly happened and never directly stating that there were men committing rapine and calling it spiritual wifery, like a temporary marriage, free love. So, date May 29th, 1844, 2 years after the young men and these older men, a lot of men were excommunicated in the High Council minutes. It's documented, so many witnesses. Anyway, many victims had come forward because Emma and Joseph were going from place to place asking people, like, if someone's teaching spiritual wifery, this is not from us. We do not live spiritual wifery. A couple of decades later, Vienna Jackie's recounts how Emma Smith told her if anyone came to her doorstep talking about spiritual wifery, to grab a fire poke and run them out. That's how aggressive these men were. This was told to Joseph Smith III years later, maybe a couple decades later, not that much longer actually, but Vienna Jackie's tries to explain how plural marriage differentiates from it, and says that it's plural marriage is good and holy and right. But it was the moment she starts talking about plural spiritual wifery that she wells up in tears, just cries and shakes, and she whispers. It's like not something they really talk about. So I think that's why Utah is sort of, their ancestors only whispered and sort of talked about it, but they talk loudly about plural marriage, but spiritual was so bad and just traumatizing and awful. It's consistent. Anyway, he believes that she's contradicting herself in his writing. But she knew the difference, and we need to too. If you read this conclusion talking to her, he makes it sound like she suddenly condemns plural marriage after defending it, and he was just basically tripped up. So spiritual wifery was actually polyamory, not polygamy. Totally different words. But even that word is too benign because it assumes like there might be some consent there. Assuming, anyway, Eliza R. Snow called what Chauncey Higby and Bennett did prostitution, and so did Emma. They used those exact words. Emma used the word pimp, okay? High Council minutes show that it was exactly what Jeffrey Epstein did, and the phrase vehemently pursued is how they described Chauncey Higby. It was frequently used by the victims, telling them repeatedly, they told those men, and I'm not quoting the Church Historian Press anymore, by the way, sorry. No, and so this is just, I'll give all of my links to all this later. So not only the man's desires, only the men's desires were respected, whereas Joseph's plural wives paint him as something who even wanted consent to be able to propose. Like Emily was like, why are you handing me a piece of paper? I'm scared, don't. He's like, oh, you want me to stop talking? Okay, runs away. They live in the same house for a year, doesn't touch her, doesn't propose to her again until she comes up and says, okay, I'm ready to know what you're gonna say. He's not physically coming at her, and so she literally said that he never took liberties like that, is they're directly asking her, did he put his arm around you? Did you go like this a lot? Was he in habit for like 2-3 pages in the Temple Lot case, if you read it. Like, did you hold her hand? Was he always holding your hand? Was he always, they were really trying every way they could to see if he seduced her. And she's like, no, not before we were married. Of course, after you're married, like, I mean, things happen. And she said they did. But in March 1844 speech titled The Voice of Innocence, Emma speaks of women who had like recently lost their husbands. Victims of the Hans Mill specifically was Catherine Warren. She was prostituted. But anyway, this speech was written by W.W. Phelps denouncing spiritual wifery. The women, Emma wrote it for the women. She actually crossed out rapine, but she still alludes to it, you know, and she's editing his version, but it's all denouncing spiritual wifery if you read it. And in End of the Nauvoo Neighbor, Joseph Smith had to have approved that, you know. Anyway, and so you see now why that really made Bennett and Law and their whole clan. They had a whole church that they started. They had death threats. William Law was not a good guy. He used death threats against Emma for standing up against traffickers, because they were. Okay. The past several years, talking directly to some working in the church history department, Joseph Smith papers, like, I know they're not perfect. People get hung up on that, but I can vouch, you know, they basically simply work through the church. You know, I know who they are, know their names, and they have a stewardship, like the Saints book. It's a stewardship. They're trusted to do a good job and to do the best that they can. And they're just not micromanaged by the prophet, although they did approve of it. But anyway, but they'll be biased, and sometimes they're wrong. I found some biased things in there. I'm like, I don't know. Whereas if you read a church historian, which is not written as a narrative, it's totally different. Because something written as a narrative, can go a lot of different ways. But anyway, But it's interesting to me how church historians a lot of times talk about Joseph Smith and they're just like, he was not perfect. It's like ... And I would say the same about them. They are not perfect either ... But they're not awful men, and it's not some huge conspiracy as others think. I don't see it that way. But Liza Snow, going on, was accused of lying, obviously, when she signed the affidavit. So I'm not his cloistered sister, spiritual wife, saying at the time, this is Liza Snow, the Sisters Relief Society signed her article, I was married to the prophet. We made no allusion to any other system of marriage than Bennett's. It was prostitution, and it was truly his, and he succeeded in pandering his course on the credulity of the unsuspecting by making them believe that he was thus authorized by the prophet. In those articles, there's no reference to divine plural marriage. We aimed to put down its opposite. It literally was opposite. To the women, you have one husband, physically, emotionally, mentally, totally different to live plural marriage than it is to live spiritual wifery. Anyway, so numerous situations do pop up in the memoirs. President Joseph Smith III accounts from the 1860s to 1890s, and he visits all the way up until his death, really. And then he starts to really get along with Joseph F., because at that point he's had 3 wives, just not at once, and Joseph F's only had 5. Not as many as Brigham Young, you know. I don't know. He knew that they would never use the word polygamy. It was always celestial marriage. You know, he's a good evidence of them saying spiritual wife is awful, bad, and eternity only ceilings are, you're not married. You're only married if you're married. If you have a time ceiling, time marriage, you're married. If it's just eternity only, you're not married till the next life. It's generally, as they even explained it to him, generally you get married in this life and then you get sealed for eternity. Okay, that's how we do it today. We don't do plural marriage at all. In this life, you know, there's no, you're excommunicated if you do. But they call it celestial marriage. So again, it was May 1842 testimonies that were published of Catherine Warren, Sarah Miller, Nyman sisters. They sounded quite similar because they explain in the Nauvoo Neighbor that they're editing it because it needs to be appropriate. But if you read the High Council minutes, you see a lot of more differences, and it's really, really bad, really, really horrific. And so a lot of non-scholars are just like, no, it just must all be false. Just wrong, bad guy. And they seem too similar, but like if you read the High Council minutes, it's very real. And they never refuted those quotes of them. They never said, I didn't say that. They never went, oh, Chauncey Abbey is a good guy, or so is William Law, we need to defend them. That never happened. Whereas Bennett's claims of the Relief Society and all these women living spiritual wifery, that was refuted by all of the women, big time. They were like, oh. So anyway, June 7th, 1844, a week later, accusations are hurled at Joseph Smith for adultery, having many wives, basically almost using the exact same wording. Like, they weren't that creative, like what he said about Chauncey Higby. And they're calling to get rid of the police. The charter had the police, so they literally were making big strides to protect the women. That made Chauncey Higby mad. You can understand why. Also in June 1844, a little bit after that, because they're calling for the end of the charter and they're calling for mobs to come and attack these people who have already been attacked. They're doing everything they can. They just want it. They literally say they want all of Nauvoo to burn. Also in June 1844, the Nauvoo Legion then goes and burns the paper and the press, like the whole type, which is expensive. And that was illegal, but it was generally known as not being illegal. But it was, researchers say it actually was legal to destroy the papers, but not the press. So that's what got Joseph in trouble, legal trouble. But anyway, other branches of our faith also tend to believe that Joseph Smith was monogamous to Emma and that he never had any other wives. Denying Joseph Smith lived plural marriage is actually ignoring so many witnesses, in my opinion, too many, including Jane Manning, who lived in the home of Joseph Smith and talked to his wives, who confided in her that they were his plural wives. Emma's last testimony blatantly says Joseph Smith told her plural marriage was sort of okay, saying in response to the questions about spiritual wifery. So it's like really, there was no revelation on spiritual wives. There were some rumors of something of the sort, and she does mention polygamy, but there wasn't a revelation on polygamy. It was celestial marriage and sealings. And Utahns would say the same thing. So anyway, but he says, when I asked my husband, there were rumors of the sort, of which I asked my husband in a chat about plural wives, he said, well, such a system might be, possibly, if everybody was agreed to it and would behave as they should. And the next statement, I believe, is Emma speaking, as she's quoted saying, but they would not. Because like William Law and some of these other, like Sidney Rigdon, some of them were spiritual wifery was a lot more tempting than plural marriage. And I personally believe Emma seeing men being taught plural marriage and going straight into spiritual wifery, being excommunicated. Some were apostles, like William Law, Sidney Rigdon. I think she was just emotionally scarred from that because she was like a midwife. She was really stay present. She knew every single case. And it was just exhausted her, I believe. It just emotionally was just done. And I would be too. And plural marriage was hard, but spiritual wifery, I think, was even worse on her, having to deal with it and just losing trust in the men around her. She knew her husband didn't live, and she's like, no, he didn't do that, you know. Parley P. Pratt, basically, what he accused Sidney Rigdon of that, spiritual wifery, so I don't know. Emma is grilled in another question about polygamy, spiritual wifery, which is confusing again, is they're like not the same thing at all. One can wonder what the questions were, or if they were actually quotes, you just don't know. And she says, at one time, my husband came to me and asked me if I heard certain rumors about spiritual marriages or anything of the kind, and assured me that if I had, there were no such foundation, there was no such doctrine, and never should be with his knowledge or consent. And she goes on to say she doesn't know his father had any spiritual wives, all of which echoes what is maintained and believed today, that Joseph Smith never supported spiritual wifery, which is not polygamy, and is Joseph Smith III, who hated polygamy, is quoting Newton, supports this. So just read it and pay notice to these two different words that mean two different things. So anyway, I recently kind of felt like I should watch this one documentary about the death of Joseph Smith, and Instagram really ticked me off because I was like, wait, you have this wrong, and they would just delete it immediately. And that made me mad, and I literally got rid of my Instagram because I was just really mad, and I didn't want to vent about it, and I don't want to vent about anything else going on. As things are happening, I'm like, I don't want to be tempted to complain or get frustrated or mad. It's not appropriate. So it's too tempting on there, and just anyway. But watching it, I'm obsessed with the difference between Joseph and Hyrum. They say Hyrum is 6'4". He was 5'11", according to his son John, and Joseph was, according to him, Joseph was exactly 6 feet, but a lot of people generally said Joseph was 6'4", 6'2", above, and I have reason to believe he was slouching. There's a book, and 500 Little Known Facts of Joseph Smith is where I'm quoting it, but it was Caroline S. Callister, cousin to the prophet. She remembers this one story. Aunt Clarissa was a very fleshy woman. One day, the prophet came to this house and said he believed he weighed as much as Aunt Clarissa, but when they weighed on the scales, she weighed the most. He went in the house and got a piece of bread and butter in each hand, and he got on the scale and he was yelling, like, come down, urging the scales to come down so he would weigh more than Clarissa. So he wasn't against fudging or trying to protect someone's feelings, especially if they were family. But anyway, you consider Lacey Mack Smith was 4'11". Joseph Smith Sr. was considered to be really tall. I mean, Hyrum was not 6'4". And so these are just certain facts. And then the other thing is that they totally believe, it's like they totally believe Curtis Weaver, but they don't. And they criticize all these things that come from Curtis Weaver, though. Like most of it, they're saying the church. I'm like, just say Curtis. Curtis believes that. And he's popular belief as far as how he thinks Joseph was killed and which school is whose. Because the whole thing, their whole theory that they dive into, that they believe it was an inside job. It was John Taylor. There wasn't even a mob. But it really starts to go when they're talking about the skull and how it doesn't make sense. Because it doesn't make sense because it's not a skull that they're analyzing. They're trying to analyze Hyrum's, talking about mostly focused on Hyrum's death and skull and being shot and this. Anyway. And so I believe with the 6 doctors, 3 different publications saying the skull that was buried as Hyrum was Joseph's, and the opposite. So Joseph's skull was mostly intact. And you got Niles, Dr. Niles Herod, who does surgery in the maxilla, says that break in the maxilla is fresh. And there's no deterioration, but I'm going to talk about some of these other accounts. They're talking about the hole in the door. Anyway, I'm going to give a quote here of Henry M. Harmon of Carthage. Was at the jail during the attack in an affidavit given the LDS Church Historian's office in Salt Lake City on April 14th, 1857. It says, Joseph is the account of the death. Joseph leapt from the window. When the mob fired upon him, he fell dead. The fifer of the Warsaw Company came running into the jail, and remember, Willard Richards said he fell on his left side, brandishing his fife, it's like a flute, and he struck over Joseph, struck him several times in the head with his pewter fife. So when you look at the skull that does just have the broken maxilla on the opposite side of where Hyrum's bullet hole is, that's why we think it's Joseph's, and so many other reasons. I'll go into that in a second, but the pewter fife, what it could explain, these broken parietal, bones right there, sphenoid bones, sides of his head, basically. One side is obvious, but you can tell it's broken on both sides. So he fell on one side, and it could have just brandished right there. Anyway, he's being really graphic, I'm sorry, but this feature, but the broken, those bones being broken is what the RLDS descendants who didn't have the death mask, they didn't have copies of it. That's what they decided. They heard Hyrum was shot in the head, so they said, oh, this is Hyrum's, and they buried it as Hyrum. And that's how that started. But they knew these were the skulls of who they were, because this was their property. Their father was the son of Joseph and Emma. And Emma said, this is where your father is, their whole life, this is where your father is. So they had told the grandchildren of Joseph Smith. That's why, it was in a weird place and stuff. So anyway, motive for the murders sides with Higby and William Law, who tried to shoot Joseph Smith in early 1844. John Taylor has never been linked to them, but against them. Even 10 years later, he's just going off on William Law. They lived spiritual wifery, and those that accuse them, there's not any evidence that they didn't, really. There's too much evidence they did, is my opinion. John Taylor was a polygamist, lived plural marriage, but he didn't live spiritual wifery. He didn't share his wives. There's no evidence of that. And here's some excerpts of his account. So John Taylor's account is a book, Witness to the Martyrdom. And he's talking about June 27th, 1844. He was sitting on the front window of the jail. I saw a number of men with painted faces coming around the corner of the jail, aiming towards the stairs. The other brethren had seen the same in the door, and I found Hyrum and Dr. Richards already leaning against the door. Again, this is 10 years later. They both pressed against the door with their shoulders to prevent it from being opened, as the lock and latch were comparatively useless. While in this position, the mob who had come upstairs and tried to open the door probably thought that it was locked and fired a ball through the keyhole, and Dr. Richards and Hyrum jumped back. Shot through the keyhole, they jumped back. And then he basically says that they shot through the panel, and then Hyrum, I'll just read it, and he says, and then almost instantly another ball passed through the panel of the door. So he's not against the door anymore. And he says it would hit Hyrum on the left side of his nose, entering his face, and at the same instant another ball came from outside. And then Willard Richards just talks about wrestling the door. I'm not going to read all of it. Anyway, Joseph, Hyrum, and Taylor's coats are off. Joseph sprang to the door with his 6-shooter. Hyrum for his single barrel, and Taylor Markham's cane, and Doctor for Taylor's cane, and all sprang against the door, and the balls whistled up the stairway. In an instant, one came through the door. Joseph, Taylor, and Richards sprang to the left. Hyrum back in the front of the door and snapped his pistol. No one talks about this. That Hyrum, so something comes through the door, and then Hyrum shoots. Does he shoot through a closed door? I don't think so. I think there was a hole on the side of his head, and I think if he was right-handed, he would have been shooting like that, and it could have gone like this, and I'll show my video about that. And this would have been an accident. I've said that since 2018. Entitled to their own opinion. They have their own religious beliefs and whatever. So it's Richards that states Hyrum and Joseph left from the door, and the bullet came through, but only Hyrum goes back and shoots with a pistol. And it's just ironic. They go on and on about wounds from different types of guns, but they just suddenly decide Joseph with a pistol shoots up John Taylor, and there was no mob, but there's a wound the size of his hand on his leg. Wouldn't that be from a musket? He's describing balls coming through. And if you read everything, there were blanks shot by the Carthage Greys because they're supposed to protect it. And they were letting 100 people up there. The blanks were to show that they tried to stop them, but then there were so many more of the Carthage Greys, according to John Taylor, they were part of the mob too, but looking like the Carthage Greys. You just have to read his whole book. But Anyway, I'm an adult enough to agree with some church historians and not consider them the church and get angry. You know, I'm not angry at Curtis Weaver. I just really disagree with him, and he knows I don't agree with him since 2018. So I basically told him that, and then he was like, didn't really give me analysis of my picture, which is fine, and I didn't really want it. So I just, yeah. So, I mean, but he's a linguist. I believe more with the 6 doctors. I didn't know about the 6 doctors when I talked to him. That's why I've been like, the last 6 months, I've been finding all this stuff out. So I'm going to go and show you all of that. So the skull. So Richards is stating that there was a pewter fife. So this is a drawing by Whitaker. The pewter fife, that could explain this, the hole right there. And so just my whole theory of, and Hyrum's 6 doctors think this is Hyrum's skull, thinking that there's no facial bones. So I just wonder if an entrance wound was here. And I've gone there and taken several pictures. It looks like a tiny hole. And if you look up entrance and exit wounds, entrance wounds are off. It looks perfectly round. Like, I don't think that's a pock mark. It looks really deep to me. And so a lot of times, if it's like a pistol, entrance wound would be small, exit wound would be really big. And then here are their skulls. This is Skulls and Crossbones by Curtis Weaver. But this is his paper on page 24, Skulls and Crossbones, where he got permission for this photo. And this is where they lay. That's Emma. I don't know why you can't see her head at all. They found a woman's hair, but they think she had osteoporosis. But 6 doctors think this is Hyrum. There's Emma and Joseph. But you can even see from here how prominent this brow bone is. Okay, if you look at these skulls, even this, you can see this really prominent brow bone. And I'm going back into that in a second. If you listen to that documentary, they're shooting out that window. There'd be bullet holes on the ceiling. This is Carthage, sorry. Nauvoo History Sites. So here we can see the hole in the door. That was not patched up, and gosh, you don't see any bullet holes on the outside. Continue outside courtyard, we can do that. But I want to finish this point first. So this is where they were murdered. Gosh, I just remember reading about Joseph F. Smith coming here and just sitting on that bed and just crying. That's where his dad, Hyrum, was killed. It's just sad. So, I mean, I appreciate that at least these are 2 men, even though I don't agree with the documentary, but this is Frederick Piercy. They say 1843, I think it's 1842. Either way, it's less than 10 years after it happened. He did a drawing of the room. And what do you see? I actually posted a link to this on their YouTube channel and they deleted it. So I was rebutting a bunch of basic points from their Instagram and from YouTube, and I think that's what I kind of got mad at them. Because I was just it was just facts. I'm like, I can't post a link to this Frederick Piercy drawing. He went there, and you can see these walls are falling apart, but it's riddled. So the opposite side of this is that window Joseph fell out of. There are bullets coming out, and so there are bullets on the ceiling. I mean, these are holes. The ceiling is messed up. So this is Frederick Piercy. I think he sat there and drew as this woman is pointing out all these bullet holes on that wall opposite to the wall where Joseph fell out of and was shot. And they say bullets were coming from that window. Okay, this is Kent Van de Graaff, Human Anatomy. He wrote a book on human anatomy and believes that This is Joseph, this is Hyrum. Oh, there's Emma. Okay. Hyrum's face is gone, obliterated by the bullet that hit him in the face. Here's what he says about each mandible was positioned, and he did a comparison. So again, he doesn't try to do photoanthropometry, which I'm going to pull up a paper on that was made. Other skeletal features were important in establishing the match. Of particular significance was the prominence of the supraorbital region of the frontal bone and size and position of the mental chin region of the mandible. Other features that were considered in each skull were the shape of the frontal forehead bone. That's the big thing that I really saw on Hiram Smith's death mask and on the skull that I believe was Hiram's. Frontal region position of the orbits and the apparent size and shape of the nose. Oh yeah. Most startling conclusion of the examination is that the photographs of the skulls were incorrectly identified. A careful consideration of the skeletal features. So when he says they're incorrectly identified, and if you're new to this is Hiram's skull according to the burial ground. It's buried as Hyrum. Hiram's name is above this. So he's saying they're incorrectly identified. He's saying this is Joseph's. And then right here, this was identified as Joseph, even though he wasn't shot in the face. Hyrum was. And again, this is in Missouri. They don't have access to the death masks. They're in Salt Lake City. These are the descendants of Joseph Smith III, and all the sons visit Utah, but they didn't own the death masks or a copy of it that I know of. So this is buried as Hyrum, identified by 6 doctors. I edit that. I messed up. It's 6 doctors total. Van de Graaff is sort of much shorter analysis, and he really focuses on the shape of, and he's written books on anatomy, the shape of the frontal bone of Hyrum's, the death mask, and the skull buried is just it's missing all facial bones. The shape of it is amazingly similar. So the mandible was mostly intact, and so what had happened to the absence of the zygomatic process of the temporal bone is whereas the absence of the lateral view of the condylar heads of the mandible, articulation of the fossa not possible. Due to the loss of the midfacial structures based on the fall from 16 to 20 foot distance, makes for an interesting conjecture. However, the loss of the structures, including the sphenoid, is not consistent with the usual fracture lines of Le Forte the third or cranial facial destruction. Pattern fracture, this missing sphenoidal structure, may be better explained by multiple fragmenting comminuted fracturing. This is something I even have to learn as an ME, but doctor, so this is where I do see some weight, even though these 3 other doctors in Millions, they're from 2007, which was a specialist, is a cardiologist, gastroenterologist, and allergy doc. But me, just as an MA, all I have to learn about types of fractures, they learn a whole lot more. Even though that's not their specialty, like that is what you learn in anatomy. You have to memorize and learn about all these different breaks. Comminuted fracturing created by a rifle bullet is also evident from the photograph taken of the grave site at the time of exhumation, when the skulls were partially uncovered, that the excavation was considerably less than meticulous, which revealed bricks, rocks. Anyway, RLDS Hyrum, which he believes is Joseph, talks about a step deformity. Viewed from the intraorbital rim is where is the zygomatical frontal suture, however not evident in the submental view. The bone is intact. The buttress of the zygoma, the left zygoma, appears less prominent than the right. This is less prominent than that, and so when you look up step deformity, which I have before, they show several examples. So they're talking about the facial asymmetry. Here's this guy before, here's after. Well, you see this zygoma is less. He works on these, he's a surgeon. He works on these bones. So
He knows what he's talking about, and he's a doctor. So, hey, 2 doctors, 3 doctors in 2007. Around 2008 was Joseph Lyon, who is trying to explain, contrasting the mincing temporal sphenoidal areas which are blended and lack the crisp definition. Argument can be that the fractional lines of the maxilla could have been in IgA exhumation. He makes it as the 6th doctor that says, this is Joseph's school. This is Hyrum's. And that frontal bone, according to Van de Graaff, matches. And then you've got Dr. Herod explaining, hey, step deformity. This is post-mortem, and there's no deterioration like you see here. This was very likely the pewter fife. I'll read that again. So I always wondered, like, well, did they shoot him in the head? So as I reread the account in Search of Joseph, they say exactly, I'll put the quote in here. He was not shot in the head. Joseph was not shot in the head. Hyrum was, but he was hit in the head with the pewter fife. And it's just so broken right here, but this is a little bit more intact. So the left side of the skull is more broken than the right. And on the death mask, that matches, where there just seems to be, I've done an analysis where I did like a grid to really see, is there symmetrically more on this side? Because in my picture, there's symmetrically more on that side than that side. On the death mask, there's more on that side than on this side. But that would make sense if the skull really broke and maybe that he was scalped. I don't know. I didn't hear that. But, okay, you have the Carthage Greys, who, I mean, were military. They were trained, whereas the mob mostly weren't. But according to John Taylor, they were the mob too. But they could have climbed on this roof and had a good angle. They could have climbed in that tree. They could have been on the fence if they were really, really tall. That could have made the difference. There's damage to the ceiling. So they're saying if they were on the ground shooting in there, they would have, I'm sure they talked. The men mostly stayed out. They didn't come in until they went downstairs, made sure Joseph was dead. Then they came in the room. And if they could see well, they're in a tree or on the fence, and they're just shooting at Hyrum, maybe it could have gone through him and hit one of their friends on the stairs. I don't think if any of them were friends. But anyway, it's very, very sad. And it's a sad thing, and it's upsetting to hear sometimes other people's different opinions, but I mean, you have to respect them. I just disagree with them, and this is me disagreeing with them. Anyway, have a good day.
Okay, and so, we know that they're not perfect, John Taylor's account is gonna be different. It's 10 years later, he's not even in Illinois, whereas Willard Richards, it was soon after, and he was a doctor. And even John Taylor, I'll show a screenshot of this. He prefaces saying, there are a lot of things I couldn't remember. He's honest, like it's been 10 years and it was traumatic to me. So I don't think Joseph had a musket. I don't think Joseph shot him up. I just don't. So, you can believe what we want, but these are major things that I think that they got wrong that are really important. So I don't believe that Willard Richards and John Taylor, here's the end of what Willard Richards, it continues on. So what I read was like what was in the journal, and then the rest of it was published like a few weeks later, I guess, but written down. They just know it wasn't immediate. The ink changed is what they noticed. So if you look at Joe Smith papers, they're really anal about all these, trying to figure out who wrote what according to the handwriting, and they have handwriting experts, so they think this was not obviously immediately after. He was trying to survive and trying to save John. Willard Richards was a doctor, and he's trying to save the life of John Taylor. So he's not sitting there writing and ignoring him bleeding on the ground. So anyway, he continues and talks about Mr. Taylor rushed to the window, which is some 15 or 20 feet from the ground, when his body was nearly on a balance, a ball from the door within entered his leg, and a ball from without struck his watch and smashed it, leaving the hands at 5 o'clock. I mean, they didn't have surveillance cameras, and they're traumatized. If this wasn't exactly true, that is not uncommon. I'm going to show an example of that. But 16 minutes, and according to studies, like, people remember different things, and sometimes they don't remember things well because your fear, you blank out. Like, you go into your happy place and you're just like, you catch some details, you miss some. And so I think a lot of John Taylor's account is just going off of what other people say. And he literally says that the force of which threw him on the floor, and he rolled on under the bed, and the mob came firing upon him, cutting away a piece of his flesh from his hip as large as a man's hand. Probably a musket. And were hindered only by knocking him down with the muzzles with a stick, while they continued to reach their guns into the room, probably left-handed, aiming their discharge so far as almost to reach in the corner of the room to where we retreated and dodged. And then I recommenced the attack with my stick again. Joseph attempted, as a last resort, to leap from the window from whence Mr. Taylor had fell, when 2 balls pierced him from the door, and one in his right breast from without, and he fell outward, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." As his feet went out the window, my head went in, the balls whistling all around. He fell on his left side, a dead man. At this instant, the cry was raised. He leapt the window, and the mob on the stairs and in the entry ran out. And I withdrew from the window, thinking it of no use to leap out on 100 bayonets then around Joseph's body. Not satisfied, then I reached my head out of the window and watched some seconds to see if there were signs of life, regardless of my own, determined to see the end of him I loved. And that's it. Anyway, you believe who you want. I'm just telling you who I believe. Have a good day.